Welcome to Asian American Parenting, a podcast from Rooted Ministry and the Sola Network, where the gospel meets Asian American faith, culture, and parenting. Each episode, we explore how to raise the next generation with a strong gospel foundation in Christ while navigating the unique challenges of our cultural identity. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in. Welcome. I'm your co-host, Danny Kwan from Rooted Ministry. I'm Rooted Senior Director of Youth Ministry Content and Cross-Cultural Initiatives. And I want to introduce my co-host from the Sola Network Editorial Board, Monica Kim, a biblical counselor and psychologist. She focused her PhD work in parenting and attachment theory. And she is also my wife. We've raised 3 teenagers together. Would you like to say hello, Monica?
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here.
Anything else about yourself that you'd like to say? I know you're my wife, but also you're Canadian. Canadian American.
Right. Yeah, I'm excited to be spending some time talking about together Asian American parenting. There's so much that goes on in the midst of Asian American parenting, meeting the gospel, faith, and culture. So there's a lot in there, and I'm excited to be talking about various issues that are connected to that.
Yep. So we hope that those of you who are parents, pastors, the church, who are our listeners, will really embrace our podcast as we consider gospel-centered parenting in the Asian American context. Really thinking about like this idea, it is really vast. Like this question, what is Asian American gospel-centered parenting? And it can relate to all these different avenues, like thinking about academics and the gospel, future jobs that we think about for our kids, and how do we guide them in the gospel? How do we nurture our children's talents, but with the gospel perspective? Our anxiety as parents and Asian American influences on us and how the gospel applies in our lives. What it means that we've grown up in the first generation church or Asian American churches, and that impact on gospel centered parenting. So this question of gospel centered parenting is so vast, but I want to begin to define it as where the gospel meets Asian American faith, culture, and parenting, to all be summed up in this idea of Asian American parenting and Asian American gospel-centered parenting. And so with that kind of introduction, Monica, what is Asian American gospel-centered parenting to you, and this intersection of the gospel and faith with Asian American culture, parenting, and faith?
Mm-hmm. That's such a big question, as you have mentioned.
And can I say, I know you're coming from a psychologist and counseling perspective, but you've also done church ministry. And I was a youth and family pastor in an Asian American church for 29 years. Somehow I survived as a youth pastor in one church for 29 years. So we also bring our unique professional lenses to this podcast. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Right, as well as our personal lens too. And
Yeah, we raised 3 teenagers who are now in their early 20s.
So that question, going back to that question, what is Asian American gospel centered parenting? I imagine that as we continue on in our series of podcasts, that'll become much more nuanced because there are so many facets to it. Um, but I do think about how, let's say, uh, for Asian American um, um, Christians as parents, it is not just about, you know, being able to really, as let's say Ephesians 6 4 talks about how parents ought to raise our children up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. While that is a real important part of parenting and Asian American gospel centered parenting, that there's so much to unpack about our history and culture as Asian Americans, and also how we understand faith to bear in light of raising our children. And so, one of the things I do think about in terms of Asian American gospel centered parenting is our need to really thoughtfully reflect on how we have been raised up ourselves,
Yep.
uh,
Yep.
and the impact of our Asian American parents who have parented us, and what kind of um, Asian American culture, but also how it intersects with the gospel from our parents have been passed down to us, but also how it impacted us. I think that is like one big area to think about and reflect on, because while the gospel calls us as parents to really raise our children up in the Lord and in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord, it becomes so nuanced as to how it looks like and what it ends up being. And so I just wanted to put that out there.
One example of that I think is really funny, and I talk about this example a lot, is the Asian American comedian Ronnie Chen. And he talks about, in Asian American culture, the exaltation of wanting your children to become a doctor. And he makes this joke that it helping people is so low on the totem pole of why we want our children to become doctors, or it's not even, doesn't even make the list of why, but it's really for Asian Americans. It's about money and prestige, that helping people is not even on the list. And that impacts maybe the way, as Asian American parents, we were raised, and how that's influenced our view. So the way my parents thought about it, the way I thought about it, how they parented me, and how we parented our children, you and I, Monica. But then also how we, make the gospel really challenge that kind of um, view. And I just think it's really funny because, we had a kid who wanted to go to med school, and I was so excited where, you were more balanced about it. But again, it was maybe in my heart, I'll confess, I was more about the prestige. But, you know, uh, but, and then when he decided to do cancer research, I was like angry, you know, and where is the gospel? I'm a pastor, and I'm just wondering, where do I apply the gospel in my life, in my idolatry and sin there?
Yeah. And I think you're mentioning an important point, bringing up Ronnie Cheng. the comedian in regard to Asian American culture and how Asian American culture it can impact or influence the way we think about gospel centered parenting. Not that they don't go together, and but that we may misunderstand or misuse, in some sense, the gospel to even enhance those things that we think are good hopes for our children
Mhm.
as parents. And while there is that real sense of, and I don't think this is like unique to the Asian American culture,
Yeah.
in terms of the desire for our children to be successful,
Yeah.
the desire for our children to have a place in the world that they feel really good about, that's related to their, position, but also the income that they will be able to get. That's not unique to the Asian American culture, but however, I think there's another facet that I think comes to mind, which is how immigrants, our parents, most of our parents, were first generation immigrants, and that how they came with the common story of not having much,
Yeah.
because a lot of them came from a lot of various difficult cultural places, or um, in history, in very different, various different Asian American countries.
Yeah.
And so a lot of our immigrant story involves trauma, refugee status, coming from war torn countries, not
Poverty.
yeah, a lot of poverty, not having much, so a lot of threat, and so with all of that, kind of a history and culture, you're talking about so many nuances or so many aspects of culture or Asian American kind of history and culture generationally that have impacted their parenting, and how all of that intersected with the gospel.
And in that way, I want to make sure to for our listeners to know that in no way is this podcast supposed to shame them or guilt them or make them feel bad. You and I are parents on this journey of trying to live out the gospel as parents. And we also want to celebrate the good things about our Asian Americanness, that God has placed us in our cultural heritage. Um, we also want to, not tell you know, parents that they're all wrong, being Ronnie Chen's, or, like, you're being tiger moms, or, you're not doing it right. But we're really trying to discuss how Asian American parents can really navigate faith, culture, and a gospel foundation in their parenting.
Hmm. And so just going back to that question you had asked in the beginning, what is Asian American parenting, where it also meets the gospel and faith? Well, what is that all about? I think it would be hard to really answer it to in a succinct way, but again, really having to be thoughtful and reflecting on our culture, heritage, histories, um, but also how the gospel really informs and impacts that kind of cultural view for the glory of God
Hmm.
for the generations to come, as we think about our children and what is going to be important to be able to parent, how it's going to be important to parent our children reflectively in the gospel.
Because where is that balance, or where is the priority of our citizenship is in the kingdom of God, as people of faith, but we're also uniquely Asian American parents. And how do we balance or prioritize
Mhm.
faith versus our Asian American identity and culture?
Mhm.
Um, what do you think about that?
Mhm. Uh, how to balance it? I think that's a um, I think there's always a challenge when it's when we're thinking about how do you balance a the culture and the gospel. I think it's more to me when I'm thinking about that question is how do you uh, reflect on the gospel informing uh, cultural and historical ways of parenting,
Hmm.
not to erase it, but how it really will um, uh, uh, help us to uh, reorient ourselves to what is most important and how to prioritize. And I think to be able to get to that, again, going back to the need for us to be reflective on where we've come from as a history of people, it's kind of like exegeting our own culture and heritage and our history as we think about how the gospel impacts and applies. The other part is also not only being able to reflect and unpack some of that history and culture, but also how we are to embrace with humility the way in which not only our parents, but also ourselves may have um, gotten sidetracked by cultural calls and mandates that we feel so pressured by. And I'm not saying that it's a simple when you understand it, then you'll replace it with the gospel. But it is this journey into being ever so humble to recognize that we're often going to get sidetracked.
Hmm.
We'll continue to need to journey and reorient and reflect upon the gospel. Because if I think about my own parenting journey, it's been a journey where I've had to really wonder to myself, am I placing a well behaved child and how they look because I want them to present our family well above how my child is to love the Lord and to be able to love others well.
Hmm.
Like I've had to really think about that a lot over and over again throughout. Am I using the gospel to help myself feel better about my children, or am I using the gospel to really love my children so that they will be trained in the instruction and discipline of the Lord to know them more,
Yeah.
how it pans out to their behavior or how it pans out to how they will use their careers,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. And so I know that's a bit of a long way of answering your question about balance, but I do think it's a journey and how that journey, in that journey, we're always reorienting ourselves to the gospel because of the need for reflection and humility and repentance
Hmm.
continuously.
Yeah. Can I ask you? I'm going to also answer for myself from being a youth and family pastor in an Asian American church for, 29 years.
Mhm.
Also working at Rooted and working with a lot of Asian Americans, and you being a family and marriage counselor, have a PhD studying parenting and family and things like that. And, you also counsel
Mhm,
Asian Americans.
mhm,
And in the church, you served alongside with me, um, in a 2-for-1 setting in an Asian American church. Sorry, you served faithfully with me, but didn't get paid. But we love our church. We love our church.
mhm,
Um, but but is there some general or a few more predominant issues you might say you see in Asian American parenting and raising kids? Again, we want to celebrate and not make people feel guilty and you know, uh, browbeat them with the, gospel and guilt them. But are there some issues that you see Asian American parents,
mhm,
um, one or two that are generally more prevalent in the lives of Asian American parents? And we've spoken in a lot of churches. um, you know you counsel a lot of families generally, but also Asian American families.
mhm. Um, in my experience and understanding, I would say that two that kind of stands out is and is the idea of the pressure to achieve,
Hmm.
and also proper maybe you might call it, saving face, but having a being proper, a certain having to be a certain way, or behave a certain way. I think those two are pretty heavily emphasized, I think, in my experience of Asian Americans or immigrant, parents.
do,
Uh,
do, do you think that's, like, let's say you and I, our parents immigrated here and we're second gen parents, and our kids were born here and they're third gen. Do you think that that pressure to succeed is something we've inherited and we pass that on to our raising of our kids as Asian Americans, and we put that pressure on our children?
mhm. I think it could be for multiple reasons. Uh, I think a lot of our Asian, immigrant parents came from a lot of traumatic histories, uh, and whether it was war torn countries, or um, escaping, revolutions, or various different kinds of um, uh, um, uh, cultural, or country of origin issues, that is also, given all of that, there's also this kind of experience of scarcity and need to survive from all of that. And so I do think that that can produce a sense of a pressure to achieve, the sense that uh, if we don't achieve or succeed in some form, then we won't survive. And uh, given that kind of a history or background, um, and then I suppose, in addition to the idea of, I don't want to say that, every Asian American culture, is influenced by Confucian, culture, but Confucianism also it does place such heavy emphasis on the importance of being very devoted to the family, and
Hierarchy.
respect, and the idea of education, and how important all of those values are. And so if you put all of that, together, I do think that sometimes, then, if you add in this idea of needing to maintain that cultural kind of idea of education, respect, value for the family, and then survival, in addition to do it all for the glory of God.
Yeah.
If you kind of put it all together, it's almost like these levels of now we have to do it all for the glory of God, but
Yeah.
get so messed up sometimes, or messy, or very entangled in ways that then adds on to such pressure to achieve.
Hmm.
And in some families, the children may not have experienced that direct kind of talk of pressure to achieve, but you may see it in the behaviors of the parents, where they are just maybe at work all the time, and then they don't have enough, time for spending with their children growing up. And the children internalize this feeling of, wow, my parents are working so hard for me. I feel really guilty, or feel the need to want to, or really help my parents and care for them well. Because in the family, there is this idea of, again, respect for authority, and being able to be, and also um, emphasizing the importance of the family and devotion to family, such that you'll still experience this sense of this pressure to achieve, and then add on to it, okay, now we need you to be a good Christian on top of that.
Mhm.
That can get really intense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. I think it's going to be a good topic that we can explore in our next episode. Um, but before we end and go into that in the next episode, just wanted to get the listeners to get to know you and I a little bit better. We'll end each episode with a little bit of a lighter question. So, my question to you, just for the listeners, is what is your most cherished memory as a teenager for you?
Mhm. I'd have to, there are a lot of cherished memories, and I'm thinking, that's a hard one in terms of what is my most treasured memory as a teenager. Uh, I think one I remember is, at school, for English class, I really did love English class, and, all the various different literature books that we were reading. And there was an assignment on being able to either you can write about it or present it, or you can use any kind of form to do this project. And it was a project about um, your own history. And I used the time to interview my grandmother, who shared with me about how being Korean, at the time that she lived, Korea was occupied by Japanese, and so she had to learn a lot of Japanese, the Japanese language, and she tried to kind of tell me about that. And so I just interviewed,
Pachenko. Just kidding.
but I did interview her on her experiences, and what I did do was then share her history through like a spoken soliloquy about
Mhm.
reflection on her life. And I was just really surprised that my teacher, and also my classmates, really, really enjoyed that. So I did get some really good, yeah, encouragement about what was shared.
Well, my most cherished memory is my dad. My mom did the daily cooking, but my dad really loved like gourmet cooking, and he was a kind of an amateur chef. Was great at making a lot of dishes. He trained to be a sushi chef, and I remember when he trained to be a sushi chef, he made all these sushi dishes, just not only just regular sushi, but just all these different Japanese dishes. And we really, our family, and a lot of Asian families, I think, eating together was kind of our love language. So my most cherished memories as a teenager was eating together good food that my dad made. And I think that's something that you and we passed along to our kids. And so
Mhm.
that's a great cherished memory for me.
Mhm.
Well, thank you for listening to the first episode of Asian American Parenting. We really ask you to subscribe to the podcast, Asian American Parenting, and we look forward to our next episode where we continue to think about what is Asian American gospel centered parenting. And until that time, may we embrace the hope and joy of the gospel and believe that it's true, powerful, and transformative in our parenting and in our personal lives. Thank you. See you later. We hope that you have enjoyed this podcast. For more resources, visit the show notes. See you next time.